The sun was already high in the sky when Helen Walsh pulled into the gravel parking lot of Pinewood Shooting Range. The place looked busier than she expected for a Tuesday morning. She parked her old blue sedan between a shiny black truck and a luxury SUV, both sporting gun manufacturer stickers on their rear windows. Helen took a deep breath before reaching for her worn leather case from the passenger seat. At 76, every movement required a bit more care than it used to. Her joints protested slightly as she stepped out of the car, but she stood tall. Despite her age, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. The weight of the case in her hand was familiar, comforting even. She'd carried it for more decades than some of the people here had been alive. As she walked toward the entrance, she noticed a group of young men in tactical vests and matching caps gathered near the door, their laughter a bit too loud for the peaceful countryside setting. The men paused their conversation as Helen approached. One of them, a tall fellow with a neatly trimmed beard, nudged his friend and nodded in her direction. Their eyes followed her, and Helen could feel their gazes on her back as she pulled open the heavy glass door. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of gun oil and coffee. A bell chimed as Helen entered, and the man behind the counter looked up from his computer. His name tag read Tom, and recognition flickered across his weathered face. "Well, I'll be," Tom said, a smile spreading across his face.
"Helen Walsh, it's been a while." Helen returned the smile. "Too long, Tom. My garden's been keeping me busy, but I figured it was time to shake off the rust." The group of young men had followed her inside, still talking among themselves. One
of them, wearing expensive-looking shooting glasses pushed up on his head, stepped up to the counter beside her. "Hey, we need 3 lanes, preferably together," he said to Tom, barely acknowledging Helen's presence. "You'll need to sign in first," Tom replied, sliding a clipboard toward them. "I've got lanes 4 through 6 open," as Helen filled out her own form. She couldn't help but overhear their conversation. "Check out that case," one of them whispered, not quite quietly enough. "Probably has her husband's old hunting rifle in there." "Hope nobody's standing in the next lane," another replied. "She'll probably close her eyes when she pulls the trigger." Helen kept her eyes on her form, her handwriting as steady as it had always been. She'd heard far worse in her time. These boys, with their expensive gear and matching outfits, reminded her of fresh recruits on their first day, all confidence and no experience. Tom caught her eye and gave a small shake of his head. He knew better than to say anything. Instead, he handed Helen a lane card. "Lane 7 is all yours, Helen. Need any targets?" "Just the standard ones, please," she replied, her voice calm and pleasant. "And a box of 308 if you have it." One of the young men raised his eyebrows. "Whoa, Grandma's going big today," he said to his friends, loud enough for everyone to hear. They chuckled, checking out their own ammunition, mostly 9mm and .223 for their semi-automatic handguns and rifles. Helen paid for her lane and ammunition, then made her way to the safety area. The range was divided into 12 lanes, with dividers between each one for safety. Lane 7 put her right next to the group of young men, who were still sharing jokes as they unpacked their gear. She opened her case slowly, revealing a bolt-action rifle that looked simple compared to their tactical setups. It wasn't flashy or decorated with accessories, just a well-maintained Remington 700 with a decent scope. Helen ran her fingers along the wooden stock, feeling the small scratches and marks that told stories of its use over the years. "Hey, ma'am," said one of the men from the next lane, a stocky fellow with a buzz cut. "You sure you can handle that thing? The kick on a 308 is no joke." His friends snickered behind him. Helen looked up and smiled kindly. "Thank you for your concern," she said. "I'll manage. Just trying to help," he replied with an exaggerated wink to his friends. "I'd feel terrible if you hurt yourself." Tom's voice came over the intercom. "Lanes 4 through 8 are hot. Shooters ready." The men quickly donned their ear protection and got into position, each trying to look more professional than the next. They started firing rapidly, their semi-automatic weapons making a continuous racket. Every few shots, one of them would glance over at Helen, waiting for her to start. Helen took her time. She put on her simple ear protectors and safety glasses, then positioned herself carefully at her lane. The target paper at the far end of the range showed the silhouette of a human torso, with rings marking the center mass. She loaded a single round into her rifle and took a breath. Next to her, the young men were firing rapidly, their shots hitting the target paper but scattered across the silhouette. One of them noticed Helen raising her rifle and nudged his friend. "Watch this," he said loudly between shots. $10 says she misses the paper entirely." Helen ignored them, focusing instead on her breathing. She raised the rifle to her shoulder, feeling the familiar weight against her body. Her hands, though marked by age spots and slightly gnarled from arthritis, were perfectly steady as she peered through the scope. She breathed in, then out, then gently squeezed the trigger during the natural pause between breaths, just as she had done thousands of times before. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, but she absorbed the recoil with practiced ease. The shot echoed through the range, momentarily distinct from the rapid fire of the other lanes. Helen lowered her rifle and calmly worked the bolt to eject the spent casing. She didn't immediately load another round, instead looking through a small pair of binoculars to check her shot. "Completely missed, didn't she?" one of the young men said, laughing as he reloaded his magazine. The target showed a small hole, dead center. Helen permitted herself a small smile and loaded another round. By now, the young men had resumed their rapid fire, occasionally glancing her way with amused expressions. She took her time, lining up her second shot with the same careful precision. Again she breathed, aimed, and fired. Again the bullet found the center of the target. After her fifth shot, all perfectly placed in a tight group at the center, Helen paused to reload. That's when she noticed the shooting in the next lanes had slowed. The young men were still firing, but their rhythm had changed and they were looking more at her target than their own. "Lucky shots," one of them muttered, but with less conviction than before. Helen continued her methodical shooting, each bullet finding its mark with unerring accuracy. Her movements were deliberate, economical, the product of years of disciplined practice. There was no wasted motion, no flashy stance or rapid fire, just pure precision. By her 15th shot, the range had grown quieter. The young men were still shooting, but they had slowed down considerably, their earlier bravado replaced by puzzled concentration. They kept glancing at Helen's target, then at each other, their expressions shifting from amusement to confusion. Tom walked down the line, checking on the shooters. When he reached the group of young men, he stopped and watched Helen fire another perfect shot. "Impressive, isn't it?" he said quietly to them. "She's using a scope," one of them replied defensively. "And taking forever between shots." Tom just smiled. "Range isn't always about speed, son." He moved on, stopping briefly at Helen's lane. He didn't say anything, just gave her a respectful nod, which she returned before focusing on her next shot. The youngest of the men, who had been the quietest of the group, finally spoke up. "Who is she anyway? Some kind of instructor?" "Nah," his friend replied, though with less certainty than before. "Probably just got lucky with a few shots." Helen could hear them talking, but she remained focused on her shooting. This wasn't about them. This was about the discipline she'd maintained for over 50 years, the skill that had defined much of her life. As the hour progressed, the young men's shooting improved somewhat. They slowed down, took more time with their aim, and their groupings tightened. Occasionally, one of them would look over at Helen's methodical routine with something approaching respect. When the range officer called for a ceasefire to change targets, Helen unloaded her rifle and stepped back from the firing line. She removed her ear protection and wiped a bead of sweat from her brow. Despite her age, she felt alive here, connected to the woman she had been decades ago. The targets were brought forward, and the contrast was undeniable. The young men's targets showed scattered hits across the silhouette, improving toward the end, but still inconsistent. Helen's target had a tight cluster of holes in the center, so close together that many had overlapped into a single ragged hole. "Holy," one of the young men whispered, staring at her target. Tom approached with a fresh target sheet for Helen. "Still got it, I see," he said with a wink. "Some things you never forget," Helen replied simply. As she set up her new target, Helen could feel the change in the atmosphere. The mockery had faded, replaced by curious glances and whispered questions. She didn't mind. She hadn't come here for their approval or even their respect. She had come because the range was where she belonged, where years fell away and only the next shot mattered. The young men would learn eventually, or they wouldn't. Either way, Helen Walsh would continue hitting the center of the target just as she always had. After the ceasefire ended and shooting resumed, the atmosphere at Pinewood shooting range had shifted. Helen Walsh continued her methodical routine, but now the young men in the neighboring lanes kept stealing glances at her between their own shots. Their earlier mockery had given way to a mixture of confusion and reluctant curiosity. The one with the beard, who seemed to be their unofficial leader, whispered something to his friends. They nodded and he cleared his throat. "Hey, ma'am," he called over to Helen during a brief pause in shooting. Helen lowered her rifle and turned toward him with a polite expression. "Yes?" "That's some pretty good shooting," he said, his tone less condescending than before. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" Helen smiled slightly. "Here and there," she replied, not elaborating further. She turned back to her lane, raised her rifle, and fired another perfect shot. The young man frowned, clearly unsatisfied with her answer. He shared a look with his friends and shrugged before returning to his own shooting. Tom, who had been watching from the range officer's station, walked over to their section. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching Helen complete her set with impressive precision. "Excuse me," said the youngest of the group, the one who had been quietest until now. "Is she some kind of champion shooter or something?" Tom chuckled. "You could say that." "What's that supposed to mean?" asked the bearded one. Tom studied the young men for a moment, considering how much to share. "Let's just say Mrs. Walsh has forgotten more about marksmanship than most people will ever learn," the buzz-cut man scoffed. "Come on, she's just an old lady with a hunting rifle." Tom's expression hardened slightly. "Son, showing respect costs nothing, and sometimes the people you least expect are the ones with the most to teach you." He walked away, leaving the young men exchanging puzzled glances. Their earlier bravado had been punctured, leaving them uncertain about how to proceed. Helen, for her part, remained focused on her shooting. Each round found its mark with the same consistent accuracy. Her movements between shots were unhurried but efficient, betraying years of practice and muscle memory that even age couldn't erase. After another 20 minutes of shooting, Helen emptied her magazine and stepped back from the firing line. She rolled her shoulders gently, feeling the familiar ache that always came with a good session. As she began to pack up her rifle, the bearded young man approached, this time without his usual swagger. "Excuse me, Mrs. Walsh," he said, his tone noticeably more respectful. "I'm Garrett. These are my friends Liam, Pete, and Doug." He gestured to each of his companions in turn. Helen nodded politely. "Nice to meet you, boys." "We were wondering," Garrett continued, "if you might give us some pointers. Your grouping is incredible." Helen looked at them thoughtfully. Their expensive gear and earlier attitude suggested they weren't used to asking for help, especially from someone they had dismissed so quickly. "Why would you want pointers from an old lady?" she asked mildly. Garrett had the grace to look embarrassed. "We were out of line earlier. I apologize for that." The others nodded, though Pete, the one with the buzz cut, seemed less convinced than the others. "I appreciate the apology," Helen said, "but I'm not sure what I could teach you that your fancy equipment hasn't already." "Equipment doesn't make the shooter," said Liam, the youngest one. "That's becoming pretty clear." Helen smiled at that. It was something she had been saying for decades. Maybe these boys weren't completely hopeless after all. "All right," she agreed. "I can spare a few minutes. Who wants to go first?" Doug stepped forward. He was tall and lanky with glasses that kept sliding down his nose. "I've been having trouble with consistency," he admitted. "I can get a good shot now and then, but never a tight grouping like yours." Helen nodded and watched as Doug took his position at the firing line. His stance was wide, his grip on his tactical rifle too tight. He fired 3 shots in quick succession, hitting the target but with considerable spread. "Stop," Helen said. "You're fighting your rifle." "What do you mean?" Doug asked, looking confused. Helen set her cane against the divider and stepped closer. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to his stance. Doug nodded, and Helen gently adjusted his position, moving his feet closer together and relaxing his shoulders. "Rifle isn't a wild horse that needs to be tamed," she explained. "It's more like a dance partner. You need to work with it, not against it." The other young men watched attentively as Helen corrected Doug's grip and posture. "Now take a deep breath," she instructed. "As you exhale, pause naturally before breathing in again. That pause is your window. Squeeze the trigger then. Don't pull it." Doug followed her instructions, focusing on his breathing. His next 3 shots were noticeably closer together on the target. "Better," Helen said with an approving nod. "Practice that until it becomes second nature." Pete stepped forward next, his earlier skepticism still evident in his expression. "No offense, but breathing techniques are basic stuff. I was hoping for something more advanced." Helen looked at him steadily. "The basics are advanced, young man. Most shooters never truly master them because they're too busy looking for shortcuts." She pointed to his target, which showed a scattered pattern across the center mass. "You're anticipating the recoil, which is throwing off your aim. It's a common mistake, even among experienced shooters." Pete frowned. "I've been shooting for years. I don't flinch." "I didn't say you were flinching," Helen corrected. "I said you're anticipating. There's a difference. Your body is tensing before the shot, preparing for the kick. Here, try something." She took an empty brass casing from her pocket and placed it on the front sight of Pete's unloaded rifle. "Aim down range and squeeze the trigger without disturbing that casing," she instructed. Pete tried, but the casing fell off before he could complete the trigger pull. He tried again with the same result. "See?" Helen said. "You're moving before the shot. Your mind knows the recoil is coming and your body is reacting to it in advance." Pete looked genuinely surprised. "I had no idea I was doing that." "Few people do," Helen replied. "It takes time and self-awareness to correct. Dry fire practice helps. That means practicing your trigger pull with an unloaded weapon." For the next half hour, Helen worked with each of the young men, identifying small issues in their technique that were affecting their accuracy. Despite their earlier attitudes, they proved to be attentive students. Even Pete, the most resistant of the group, seemed to be taking her advice seriously. As they practiced under her watchful eye, Garrett finally asked the question they'd all been wondering. "Mrs. Walsh, if you don't mind me asking, where did you learn to shoot like this? Were you in competitions or something?" Helen paused, considering how much to tell them. These young men with their matching gear and tactical accessories lived in a different world than the one she had known. "I was in the military," she said simply. "A long time ago." "Wait, really?" Liam asked, eyes widening. "Women weren't allowed in combat roles back then, were they?" "Not officially, no," Helen agreed. "But there were special circumstances sometimes." The young men exchanged glances, clearly intrigued. Tom, who had been listening from nearby, stepped closer. "Mrs. Walsh is being modest," he said. "She wasn't just in the military. She was one of the best sharpshooters they ever had." Helen gave Tom a look. "That was a different lifetime, Tom. The younger generation should know their history," Tom replied with a shrug. "Especially when it's standing right in front of them, giving them free lessons." Garrett's eyes widened. "Wait, are you the Helen Walsh from the Gulf War?" Flicker of surprise crossed Helen's face. "You've heard of me?" "My dad was a Marine," Garrett explained. "He told me stories about a female sniper instructor who could outshoot anyone on the range. They called her the librarian, because she was so quiet but knew everything there was to know about shooting." Helen hadn't heard that nickname in years. It brought back memories of dusty ranges and young recruits, not so different from these boys, looking to her for guidance. "Your father has a good memory," she said with a small smile. "And a loose tongue, apparently." "So it's true?" Pete asked, his earlier skepticism completely gone. You were really a sniper instructor? Helen nodded. For 22 years, and yes, I saw combat, though that wasn't my primary role. The atmosphere in their section of the range had completely transformed. The four young men were looking at Helen with newfound respect, perhaps even a touch of awe. Would you mind telling us about it? Liam asked eagerly. Helen checked her watch. Another time, perhaps. I have a garden that needs tending and a cat that gets very upset if dinner is late. Will you be back here? Doug asked. We usually come on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Helen considered this. It had been years since she'd visited the range regularly. After Richard passed away, she had put her rifle away for a long time, the memories too painful. But today had reminded her how much she enjoyed the discipline of shooting, the focus it required. I might stop by on Thursday, she said, if my arthritis isn't acting up. Tom smiled knowingly. I'll keep lane 7 open for you. As Helen gathered her things, the young men helped her pack up her rifle and carry her case to the car. Their earlier mockery seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by genuine respect. Thank you for the lessons, Mrs. Walsh, Garrett said as she unlocked her car door. We really appreciate it. Helen nodded. Remember what I told you. Shooting isn't about having the fanciest equipment or the fastest rate of fire. It's about patience, discipline, and respect, for your weapon and for yourself. As she drove away, from Pinewood Shooting Range, Helen felt a familiar warmth in her chest. Teaching had always been her true calling, even more than shooting itself. Perhaps it was time to return to it, even in this small way. In her rearview mirror, she could see the 4 young men still standing in the parking lot, watching her go. They had a lot to learn, not just about shooting, but about life. But then, again, didn't everyone? Helen smiled to herself. Thursday would come soon enough. Thursday morning arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze, perfect conditions for shooting. Helen woke earlier than usual, a familiar excitement stirring within, her that she hadn't felt in years. She moved around her small house with purpose, feeding her orange tabby cat named Rusty, who watched her with curious eyes as she moved with more energy than normal. Don't look so surprised, Helen told the cat as she filled his bowl. I wasn't always the old lady who gives you too many treats. After breakfast, Helen went to her closet and pushed aside her everyday clothes to reach the back. There, hanging in a protective cover, was her old shooting jacket. She hadn't worn it in nearly a decade, not since Richard's funeral, when she'd packed away most reminders of their shared passion. The jacket was a deep olive green, made of canvas with padded elbows and shoulders to absorb recoil. Helen slipped it on, surprised to find it still fit reasonably well. In the mirror, she saw flashes of her younger self, the woman who had once been feared and respected on ranges across 3 continents. At the gun safe hidden behind a bookshelf, in her study, Helen dialed the combination and opened it for the 2nd time that week. Inside, beyond her Remington, sat other tools from her previous life: a spotting scope of exceptional quality, a rangefinder, and a small notebook filled with ballistic calculations in her neat handwriting. She considered for a moment, then took out the spotting scope. If she was going to teach those boys properly, she'd need to show them exactly where their shots were landing. The drive to Pinewood Range felt shorter this time, her mind busy with thoughts of what lessons would be most valuable. The young men had decent instincts but poor fundamentals, a common problem with self-taught shooters who learned from videos rather than proper instruction. When Helen pulled into the parking lot, she immediately noticed the black truck from Tuesday. So at least one of them had shown up. As she gathered her things from the passenger seat, another vehicle pulled in. The blue SUV that belonged to Doug, if she remembered correctly. Inside the range, Tom greeted her with a knowing smile. They've been here for 20 minutes already, he said. All 4 of them. Liam even called yesterday to make sure you were really coming. Helen raised her eyebrows. Did he think I was making it up? I think they're afraid you might change your mind about teaching them, Tom replied. Pete spent an hour on the internet last night looking you up, found some old military newspaper clippings. Helen sighed. Nothing stays buried forever, I suppose. You should be proud of your record, Tom said. I know Richard always was. The mention of her late husband brought a brief pain, But Helen nodded. He never did miss a chance to brag about me, did he? Never, Tom agreed with a warm smile. Lane 7 is ready whenever you are. Helen made her way to the range floor, where she found all 4 young men already set up. They had arranged their equipment neatly and to her surprise had left lane 7 open between them, a sign of respect she hadn't expected. Mrs. Walsh, Liam called out, his face lighting up when he saw her. You came. I said I would, Helen replied simply. She set down her case and began unpacking with the same methodical precision she'd shown on Tuesday. The young men watched her, their earlier mockery completely gone. Even Pete, the most skeptical of the group, seemed eager to learn. We've been practicing what you showed us, Garrett said. Doug's grouping has improved a lot. Helen nodded. Let's see it then. For the next hour, Helen watched as each of the young men demonstrated what they'd learned. They had indeed been practicing. Their stances were more balanced, their grips less tense, and their breathing more controlled. Their results weren't perfect, but they showed promising improvement. Not bad, Helen said when they'd all finished their initial rounds. You've been paying attention. We found some articles about you online, Liam admitted. From the military, newspaper. Is it true you once hit a target at over 1,000 yards during a sandstorm? Helen smiled slightly. The story grows with each telling. It was 800 yards and it was windy, not a full sandstorm. Still, not an easy shot. That's amazing, Doug said, genuine admiration in his voice. Could you show us how you account for wind and distance? Helen considered the request. It had been years since she'd taught advanced ballistics to anyone, but the eager expressions on their faces reminded her of fresh recruits, hungry for knowledge, that might one day save their lives. All right, she agreed. Let's start with the basics of external ballistics. Helen took out her small notebook and opened it to pages of hand-drawn diagrams and calculations. The young men gathered around, their expensive rifles temporarily forgotten as they focused on the wisdom in those weathered pages. A bullet begins dropping the moment it leaves the barrel, Helen explained. Gravity doesn't wait for it to reach its target. You need to account for this drop in your aim. She drew a simple arc on a fresh page, showing the bullet's path from muzzle to target. The farther your target, the more you need to compensate. Most scopes can be adjusted for this with proper calibration, but you should know how to calculate it manually too in case your equipment fails you. The young men listened intently as Helen explained the fundamentals of ballistics, how temperature affects powder burn, how humidity changes air density, how the Coriolis effect becomes relevant at extreme distances. Wind is your greatest variable, she continued. It can change direction and speed multiple times between you and your target. Learning to read wind is as much art as science. She pointed to various flags and natural indicators around the range. What's the wind doing right now, Pete? Pete looked around, clearly unsure. Blowing left to right? At this end of the range, yes, Helen confirmed. But look at those trees halfway down. See how the leaves are moving differently? The wind is swirling there. Your bullet would drift left initially, then possibly right as it passed that point. The young men's eyes widened as they realized the complexity they'd been overlooking. How? Do you keep track of all that? Garrett asked. Practice and observation, Helen replied. Thousands of hours watching how bullets behave in different conditions. There's no substitute for experience. After the theoretical lesson, Helen had each of them shoot at targets placed at varying distances, correcting their adjustments and explaining her reasoning. With each successful hit, their confidence grew, not the brash overconfidence they'd displayed earlier in the week, but something more grounded in real skill. During a break, Doug approached Helen as she sipped water from a bottle Tom had brought her. Mrs. Walsh, he said hesitantly, can I ask you something personal? Helen studied his face. Unlike Tuesday, there was no mockery in his expression, only genuine curiosity. You can ask. I might not answer. What was it like? Being a woman in that role back then? It couldn't have been easy. Helen was silent for a moment, memories flooding back, some good, many difficult. It wasn't easy, she finally said. I had to be twice as good to be considered half as capable. Every day was a test and failure wasn't an option. She looked at the 4 young men, who had all gathered to hear her answer. The first time I outshot every man on the range, they said it was luck. The second time, they said the conditions favored me. By the 5th time, they started asking for advice. A small smile crossed her face. Not unlike you boys. Did you ever? Liam trailed off, unsure how to phrase his question. Did I ever take a life? Helen finished for him. Her expression grew solemn. That's not something I discuss, but I will tell you this. The purpose of learning to shoot well isn't to harm others. It's to protect what matters when all other options have failed. A respectful silence fell over the group. After a moment, Helen checked her watch. That's enough. Philosophy for today, she said briskly. Let's see if you can hit those targets at 300 yards now. As the day progressed, Helen found herself enjoying the teaching more than she had expected. These young men, for all their initial bravado, were quick learners when properly motivated. By mid-afternoon, they were hitting targets at distances that would have seemed impossible to them just days ago. You're natural teachers, Tom commented during another break, as they watched the young men practice what Helen had taught them. They're eager students, Helen replied. That makes all the difference. Will you keep coming back? Tom asked. They'd benefit from more of your knowledge. Helen watched as Garrett helped Liam adjust his scope, using the techniques she'd shown them. Pete and Doug were discussing wind indicators, pointing to different parts of the range as they analyzed conditions. I think I might, she said. It's good to pass on what I know before I can't anymore. Richard would be happy to see you back here, Tom said gently. He always said your talents were wasted on gardening, Helen laughed softly. He never did understand the appeal of growing things, too slow for his taste. As the range session came to an end, the young men helped Helen pack up her equipment. Their earlier condescension had been replaced by genuine respect, and Helen found herself warming to them despite their rough start. Same time next Tuesday? Garrett asked as they walked to the parking lot. Helen nodded. I'll be here. Bring a notebook next time. There's more to marksmanship than I can teach you in a day. As she drove home, Helen felt a sense of purpose that had been missing since Richard's death. For years, she had believed that chapter of her life was closed, that her skills and knowledge would die with her, unused and unshared. Now watching 4 young men transform from arrogant novices to respectful students in the span of 2 days, she wondered if perhaps she had more to give than she'd realized. Rusty greeted her at the door with his usual impatient meow, unimpressed by her renewed sense of purpose. Helen smiled as she bent to scratch behind his ears. Don't worry, she told the cat. I haven't forgotten who's really in charge around here. But as she hung her shooting jacket in the closet, this time at the front rather than hidden in the back, Helen felt something she hadn't felt in years. Anticipation for what came next. Over the next few weeks, Tuesdays and Thursdays became sacred days at Pinewood Shooting Range. Helen arrived promptly at 9 each morning to find Garrett, Pete, Liam, and Doug already there, equipment ready and notebooks in hand. What had begun as casual lessons quickly evolved into something more structured, a proper marksmanship course taught by one of the most qualified instructors most people would never know about. Word spread quietly among the regular shooters at Pinewood. Tom did his part, mentioning Helen's background to those he thought might benefit from her wisdom. Soon, other shooters began lingering near Lane 7, hoping to overhear her instructions or catch a glimpse of her legendary accuracy. You're becoming quite the celebrity, Tom commented one morning as he helped Helen carry her spotting scope to her lane. Frank asked if you might give him a few pointers after you're done with your boys. Helen raised an eyebrow. My boys? Tom grinned. That's what everyone's calling them now, Helen's boys. Helen shook her head, but a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. She'd never had children of her own. Her career had made that difficult, and by the time she and Richard had settled down, it was too late. These 4 young men weren't exactly the children she'd never had, but teaching them brought a similar satisfaction. Today's lesson was about precision at extreme distances. Helen had arranged for targets to be set up at various ranges out to 800 yards, the furthest the range could safely accommodate. It would push the limits of the young men's equipment and, more importantly, their skills. Today we're going beyond what most recreational shooters ever attempt, Helen explained as the four gathered around her. At these distances, every variable becomes magnified. A slight miscalculation in your windage can mean missing by feet, not inches. She opened her notebook to a page filled with complex calculations. These are the formulas I used in the field. Today's variables are much more controlled, but the principles remain the same. The young men copied the formulas into their own notebooks. Over the weeks, they'd abandoned much of their tactical gear in favor of more practical equipment. Gone were the matching caps and unnecessary accessories. They now dressed for function rather than appearance, a change that amused Helen greatly. "What's the most important factor at extreme distances?" she asked. "Wind reading," Pete answered, immediately. Once the most skeptical of her students, he'd become perhaps the most dedicated. "Good," Helen nodded. "And what's the most reliable way to read wind?" "Observation over time," Garrett answered. "Looking at multiple indicators from your position all the way to the target," Helen smiled. They were learning. As they prepared for their first long-distance shots, a black SUV pulled into the range parking lot. Through the large windows, Helen could see a man in an expensive-looking suit step out, followed by two others. Something about their bearing caught her attention, the way they carried themselves, alert and aware of their surroundings. Military or law enforcement, she guessed. Tom greeted the newcomers and spoke with them briefly before leading them toward the range floor. Helen returned her attention to her students, helping Liam adjust his scope for the increased distance. "Mrs. Walsh?" Tom called as he approached with the visitors. "Got some folks here who'd like to meet you." Helen turned, instinctively straightening her posture, an old habit from her military days. "Helen Walsh, this is Colonel James Wilson from the Army Marksmanship Unit," Tom said, introducing the tallest of the three men. "And these are Captains Reynolds and Chen." Colonel Wilson stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mrs. Walsh, it's an honor to meet you." Helen shook his hand, noting his firm grip and the respect in his eyes. "Colonel, what brings Army marksmanship to our little range?" Wilson smiled. "Word gets around when a legend comes out of retirement. When I heard Helen, the librarian, Walsh, was teaching again, I had to see for myself." Behind her, Helen could sense the excitement of her four students. They'd been fascinated by the bits and pieces of her military career that she'd shared, but having a colonel confirm her status was something else entirely. "I'm hardly teaching again," Helen said modestly. "Just sharing a few basics with these young men." "That's not what I hear," Wilson replied. "Tom tells me you've turned 4 weekend warriors into decent marksmen in less than a month. That's no small feat." Helen glanced at her students, who were trying not to look too proud. "They're quick learners, and they had decent fundamentals to begin with," she added, though they all knew it wasn't entirely true. Colonel Wilson's expression grew more serious. "Mrs. Walsh, I'll get straight to the point. We're hosting an advanced sniper training course for special operations personnel next month. Our lead instructor has been deployed unexpectedly, and we're looking for someone who can fill in." Helen blinked in surprise. "You want me to instruct Special Forces snipers?" "Colonel, I've been retired for 15 years. There must be better options." "There are other options," Wilson conceded, "but none with your experience or teaching record. Every sniper instructor in the past 20 years has studied your methods, Mrs. Walsh. Some of them directly under your guidance." Helen was speechless. She looked at Tom, who was grinning broadly, clearly in on the plan. "I told him you'd need some convincing," Tom said. "It would just be for the advanced course," Wilson continued. 3 weeks all at the Fort Benning range. Everything would be arranged for your comfort, of course." Helen's mind was spinning. The thought of instructing military snipers again, after all these years. Part of her thrilled at the idea, while another part wondered if she still had what it took. "I need time to think about it," she said finally. Wilson nodded. "Of course, here's my card. The course starts in 6 weeks, so we'd need your decision within the next 2. After the colonel and his captains departed, Helen's students bombarded her with questions. "Are you going to do it?" Liam asked excitedly. You have to, Doug insisted. This is amazing. Helen held up a hand to silence them. I haven't decided anything, and we still have a lesson to complete. She turned back to the long-distance targets. Now, who's going first? Despite her outward focus, Helen's mind kept returning to Colonel Wilson's offer as the day progressed. The thought of teaching elite military personnel again stirred something deep within her, a sense of purpose and duty that had lain dormant since her retirement. As the lesson wound down and the young men began packing up their equipment, Garrett approached Helen privately. "Mrs. Walsh," he said, his voice unusually serious, "I wanted to thank you." "For today's lesson?" Helen asked. Garrett shook his head. "For everything. When we first met, we were just playing at being shooters. We had the gear, but not the knowledge or the respect. You changed that." Helen was touched by his sincerity. "You did the hard work yourselves." "Maybe," Garrett acknowledged. "But you showed us what was possible." He hesitated, then continued. "Whatever you decide about the military thing, we want you to know how much this has meant to us." The other three joined them, nodding in agreement. "We've been talking," Pete said. "If you take the instructor job, we want to keep practicing what you've taught us. Maybe even come watch you teach the Special Forces guys if that's allowed." Helen smiled at their enthusiasm. "I haven't decided yet, and military training isn't open to civilians, even as observers." "Then we'll just have to get better on our own while you're gone," Doug said with determination. "So when you come back, you'll be impressed with our progress." When, not if, Helen noted. These boys had already decided for her. As Helen drove home that afternoon, her mind was a battlefield of competing thoughts. Could she really step back into military life, even temporarily? Was she still sharp enough, still knowledgeable enough, to teach the best of the best? She pulled into her driveway and sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the small house she'd shared with Richard. What would he have said about all this? Inside, Rusty greeted her with his usual demanding meow. Helen fed him, then went to Richard's study, a room she rarely entered these days. His military awards and photos still hung on the walls, preserved, exactly as he'd left them. In the center was a photo of the two of them, taken at her retirement ceremony. Richard in his dress uniform, Helen in hers, both looking proud and perhaps a little uncertain about the civilian life ahead of them. "What do you think I should do?" she asked the photo. Richard's face smiled back at her, offering no answers. But Helen knew what he would say if he could. He'd tell her to share her gift as long as she was able, to pass on what she knew to those who needed it. That evening, Helen called her doctor to schedule a physical. If she was going to teach Special Forces snipers, she needed to be sure her health was up to the challenge. Then she took out Colonel Wilson's card and placed it on the refrigerator with a magnet, a reminder of the decision ahead. As she prepared for bed, Helen felt a sense of anticipation she hadn't experienced in years. Life had become predictable, in retirement. Gardening, occasional visits with friends, quiet evenings with Rusty. The thought of stepping back into her former world, even briefly, was both terrifying and exhilarating. One step at a time, she told herself, an old mantra from her sniper days. Focus on the immediate task, then move forward to the next. Don't get overwhelmed by the entire mission. Tomorrow she would return to the range, teach her boys what they needed to know, and continue considering Colonel Wilson's offer. The decision didn't need to be made tonight, but as Helen drifted off to sleep, she found herself dreaming of wind flags and range calculations, of steady breathing and perfect shots. The familiar world she had once left behind, now possibly opening its doors to her once more. The morning of Helen's departure for Fort Benning dawned clear and cool. She had been up since 5, double-checking her luggage and making sure her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had clear instructions for taking care of Rusty. The orange tabby watched from the windowsill, seemingly aware that something unusual was happening. "It's only for 3 weeks," Helen told the cat scratching behind his ears, "and Mrs. Patterson spoils you more than I do." The past month had been a whirlwind of preparation. After accepting Colonel Wilson's offer, Helen had thrown herself into refreshing, Her knowledge of current military sniper tactics. Things had changed since her day. New equipment, new techniques, though the fundamentals remained the same. Her doctor had given her a clean bill of health, with just a warning not to overdo things. "You're in remarkably good shape for your age," he'd said, "but you're still 76. Listen to your body." A car horn sounded outside, her ride to the airport. Helen was surprised to see not the taxi she'd expected, but Garrett's black truck. All 4 of her students were inside, grinning at her through the windows. "What's this?" Helen asked as Garrett jumped out to help with her bags. "You didn't think we'd let you go without a proper send-off, did you?" he replied. "We're your escort to the airport," Pete added from the passenger seat. Helen shook her head but couldn't hide her smile. These young men had become an unexpected part of her life, their twice-weekly lessons evolving into something that felt a lot like friendship. The drive to the airport was filled with last-minute questions and advice. The 4 had continued their training even as Helen prepared for her temporary teaching position, and they were eager to show their progress when she returned. "Remember what I told you about practicing dry fire daily," Helen reminded them, "and keep a log of all your range. Sessions, conditions, results, everything, the data matters." "Yes, ma'am," they chorused, sounding so much like military recruits that Helen had to laugh. At the airport drop-off, there was a moment of awkwardness. These were not men accustomed to showing emotion. But then Liam stepped forward and gave Helen a quick hug. "Knock 'em dead, Mrs. Walsh," he said. The others followed suit, each with a brief embrace and words of encouragement. Doug, the quietest of the group, handed her a small package. "It's from all of us," he said. "Don't open it until you're on the plane." Helen was touched by the gesture. "I'll see you all in 3 weeks," she promised. "Try not to develop too many bad habits while I'm gone." As she walked toward the terminal, Helen felt a mix of emotions, nervousness about the task ahead, but also a profound gratitude for the unexpected turn her life had taken. 2 months ago, she had been a lonely widow whose greatest skills lay dormant and unappreciated. Now she was headed to teach elite military personnel, with 4 dedicated students waiting for her return. On the plane, once they were at cruising altitude, Helen opened the package from her boys. Inside was a sleek, professional-looking notebook with her name embossed on the cover. The first page contained a handwritten note. "To the best teacher we've ever had. May your new students appreciate you more quickly than we did. We'll be waiting for our next lesson when you return. Garrett, Pete, Liam, and Doug." The rest of the pages were blank, ready for her notes and observations during the coming weeks. Helen ran her fingers over the embossed letters of her name, deeply moved by the thoughtfulness of the gift. When Helen arrived at Fort Benning, she was met by Captain Chen, who drove her to the base. The familiar sights and sounds of military life brought back a flood of memories, some from her own service days, others from the many times she had visited bases as an instructor. "The trainees arrive tomorrow," Chen explained as they drove through the base. "Colonel Wilson wanted you to have today to settle in and review the facilities." "How many students will there be?" Helen asked. 12, Chen replied. "All experienced. Snipers from various special operations units. They've been told they're getting a special instructor, but we haven't revealed who yet." He smiled. "The colonel wants to see their faces when they meet you." Helen's temporary quarters were comfortable, but utilitarian, a small apartment in the officers' housing area. After Captain Chen left, promising to pick her up early the next morning, Helen unpacked her things and then sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by doubts. What was she doing here? These men were elite soldiers, at the peak of their careers. She was a 76-year-old woman, decades removed from active service. What could she possibly teach them that they didn't already know? Helen picked up the notebook her students had given her and flipped through the blank pages. Then she took out a pen and began to write, organizing her thoughts about what these Special Forces snipers would truly need to learn. Not just techniques or calculations, those they likely already knew, but the deeper wisdom that only came with experience. By the time she went to sleep, Helen had filled 10 pages with notes and had a clear plan for the coming days. Would serve as a reminder of her credentials. Captain Chen drove her to the training facility where Colonel Wilson was waiting. "Ready to meet your class, Mrs. Walsh?" he asked. Helen nodded, straightening her shoulders. As ready as I'll ever be. They walked together to the classroom where 12 men sat waiting. The soldiers came to attention as Colonel Wilson entered, their eyes quickly finding Helen and registering confusion. She could read their thoughts clearly enough. Who was, this elderly woman, and why was she here? Gentlemen, Colonel Wilson began, for the next 3 weeks you will be receiving advanced sniper training from one of the finest marksmen and instructors in American military history. He gestured to Helen. This is Helen Walsh. Some of you may know her by reputation or from the techniques that bear her name in the sniper manual. Helen could see recognition dawn on a few faces, but skepticism remained on others. She was used to that. It had been the story of her military career. Mrs. Walsh will be leading your training, and I expect you to give her your full attention and respect, Wilson concluded. She has forgotten more about precision shooting than most of us will ever know. With that, he nodded to Helen and left the room. 12 pairs of eyes focused on her, waiting. Helen took a deep breath and stepped forward. Gentlemen, she began, her voice stronger and more commanding than it had been in years. I'm not here to teach you how to be snipers. You already know that. I'm here to teach you how to be better than you ever thought possible. She opened her notebook to the pages she'd prepared the night before. Let's start with a question. Who can tell me the most important quality of an elite sniper? And if you say accuracy, you'll be doing push-ups. A moment of silence followed. Then one of the men, a weathered staff sergeant with piercing blue eyes, raised his hand. Patience, ma'am. Helen smiled slightly. Close. The answer is humility. She looked around the room. In this field, the moment you think you know everything is the moment you stop improving. And in your line of work, that can be deadly. She could see she had their attention now. The skepticism hadn't disappeared entirely, but curiosity had joined it. Today we're going to assess where each of you stands. Tomorrow we'll begin pushing your boundaries. By the end of these 3 weeks, I expect each of you to have surpassed what you currently believe are your limits. As the day progressed, Helen put the soldiers through a series of increasingly challenging exercises, assessing their skills and identifying areas for improvement. By mid-afternoon, the initial skepticism had largely vanished, replaced by a growing respect as Helen demonstrated both her knowledge and her still impressive shooting abilities. When they broke for the day, the blue-eyed staff sergeant approached her. Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, how did you end up back here teaching after all these years? Helen thought about the question. The full story would take too long. How 4 overconfident young men had mocked her at a civilian range. How that encounter had rekindled something she thought long extinguished. How their eventual respect and eagerness to learn had reminded her of the joy of teaching. Let's just say I was reminded that some skills shouldn't be allowed to fade away, she answered. Knowledge only has value when it's shared. The sergeant nodded thoughtfully. Well, we're grateful for whatever brought you here, ma'am. Over the next 3 weeks, Helen pushed her students harder than they'd expected, drawing on decades of experience to help them refine their skills. There were moments of frustration and breakthrough, of failure and triumph. Through it all, Helen maintained the perfect balance of demanding instructor and supportive mentor that had made her legendary during her active years. On the final day, after the formal evaluations were complete, and her students had demonstrated significant improvement across all areas, Colonel Wilson presented Helen with a plaque commemorating her service as an instructor. You've exceeded all expectations, Mrs. Walsh, he said. These men will carry your teachings throughout their careers. As Helen prepared to return home, she received a call from Tom at Pinewood Range. How'd it go? He asked. Turn those Special Forces boys into proper shooters? Helen laughed. They were already proper shooters, I just helped them become a little better. Your students here are counting the days until you're back, Tom told her. They've been practicing everything you taught them, even got a few more. Folks interested in your lessons? Tell them I'll be back on Tuesday, Helen said. But I'll need a bigger teaching area if the group is growing. On the flight home, Helen reflected on the strange journey of the past few months, From a lonely widow visiting the range to reconnect with old memories, to an instructor once again sharing her knowledge with both elite military personnel and eager civilians. It wasn't a path she could have predicted or planned, but it felt right. When her taxi pulled up to her house, Helen was surprised to see her 4 students waiting on her porch. They had brought welcome home signs and, she noted with amusement, had arranged themselves at parade rest. "Welcome back, Mrs. Walsh," they called in unison as she stepped out of the taxi. As Helen greeted them and listened to their excited updates about their progress, she felt a deep sense of contentment. She had spent her life mastering a difficult skill, and now, in what she had thought would be her quiet final years, she had found new purpose in passing that skill on to others. The mockery that had greeted her that first day at the range seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by respect, friendship, and the satisfaction of making a difference in the lives of others, both the elite soldiers she had just taught and the 4 young men who had unwittingly changed the course of her retirement. "So," Garrett asked eagerly, "when do we start our next lesson?" Helen smiled. "I was thinking Thursday, if that works for everyone. I have a few new techniques I picked up at Fort Benning that I think you boys might be ready for." Their enthusiastic response told her everything she needed to know. This new chapter of her life, unexpected as it was, had only just begun,